My audience question to you, should Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, scrap the Rwanda bill that's causing all of this angst? Well, Helen says yes, scrap it. It'll never work, and even with a tiny majority, the Lords will rip the bill to bits. Helen's right on the button. Donald, supporting a bill you don't think is right for purpose is absolute cowardice. Sums up Conservative politicians totally. George says Rwanda's just another expensive and pointless distraction, another white elephant, very much like HS2. Well, there we are. Lots of thoughts on that. Meanwhile, the COVID inquiry is trundling through its long process, multi-year, multi-million-pound bill. Today was the turn of the Prime Minister all day. And he was being grilled on his scheme when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Well, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by two guests, Professor Angus Dalgleish, and from who's a Professor of Oncology at St George's University of London, and also to my right, Elliot Keck, the Head of Campaigns at the Taxpayers Alliance. Gentlemen, a very warm welcome. I'll come to you, Professor, first. So you've been following this very closely. Indeed, you heard the Prime Minister's, the former Prime Minister's 2 days of testimony last week. Rishi Sunak, as Chancellor, he was there to, in a sense, put forward the economic situation, input into lockdowns. How do you think today went in terms of the questions that were put to him and how he responded, in particular, about the challenges on the Eat Out to Help Out scheme?
Well, first of all, he revealed something that was very important, that his job as Chancellor was to weigh the balance of the lockdown, and clearly this was never done. And we've seen throughout the inquiry that they've said some very sensible things at some stages and then come to a totally different consensus of what they actually did. And, you know, what I've always said with this inquiry, it is a bit of a whitewash because they've not answered the major questions. You know, last week we dealt with why did they not deal with the origins of the virus and everything that came with it. Now, this week, they've not been dealing with, was it justifiable to have the lockdown? Did they do a cost-benefit analysis? Well, Rishi said that was his job to do it, and he clearly didn't. Otherwise, we wouldn't have entered it. It's
quite clear that they're not really asking the question, should we have locked down at all? It seems to me the only question they're asking is, assuming the lockdowns are good, did they lock down early enough? That's been the thrust of the whole inquiry. But something else has, I think, emerged, which I don't think the barrister has properly addressed. Feels to me that he's taken the scientists, their evidence, the government scientists, as gospel. Whereas actually what we heard from the former Chancellor, now the Prime Minister today, was that actually the science and the data was evolving and shifting. And I don't think the barrister grilled the government scientists, Whitty and Valence and co, on this at all.
No, I totally agree. I thought it was awful the way that he didn't bother really holding Whitty and Valence's feet to the fire, as it were, because they both said things that were reasonably sensible and then changed their minds. And they went along with a consensus that came down from SAGE, which was then guided by modelling from Ferguson and his colleagues. And what came down was only ever the worst-case scenario for them to have a fear factor on. So all rationality went out the window, I felt.
But we heard from Rishi Sunak today that actually we were all told that SAGE had this great consensus and trust the scientists, but he said actually there wasn't that consensus within SAGE. You can sort of understand that. I mean, this thing was very fast-moving, they were all grappling with it, the advice was changing. But they didn't tell us the truth on that, did they?
They didn't tell us the truth, and they didn't tell us the truth about SAGE. SAGE is one of these great misnomers, like NICE, which misleads. I mean, there was hardly anybody on that who are proper clinicians at the coalface who saw what happened on the grounds with a new respiratory virus, which was going through the population like wildfire, and lockdown never works for a respiratory virus.
Well, and we know that, and there's lots of data that I've got serious question marks that actually the barrister's been presenting. But I know you want a real detailed analysis of the cause of the virus, whether it's from a lab leak. You've been very focused on that. I think that's a whole separate inquiry, but I'm with you completely on that. Professor, thank you so much. I'm going to turn now to Elliot Keck, Head of Campaigns at the Taxpayers Alliance. How do you think this inquiry is going? I mean, it's going to cost nearer $250 million than $100 million. It's going to take many, many years. Is this a good use of our time and resources and effort?
Yeah, so just touching on that cost, we at the Taxpayers Alliance, like many people actually over recent days, have been doing some calculations as to how much this could cost. We've actually come up with a relatively conservative estimate of £156 million, but even that would be the second most expensive COVID public inquiry ever. It would be the most expensive per day at about £109,000 per day. And what are we getting for that money? Well, at the moment, essentially what we're getting really is a soap opera, which is more concerned with who said what curse word when, and honing in on the specific issue of lockdowns and not looking at the much, much broader picture. And I think that will infuriate taxpayers, and I know it will infuriate your viewers, because we're not getting value for money from this inquiry at the moment.
And essentially, is this the establishment protecting the establishment at the expense of the politicians who, sort of, I guess almost everybody's quite happy to sort of throw under the bus and blame them? Is that what's really going on here, or do they think that they're doing a splendid job?
I think it's a refusal to look at the bigger picture, fundamentally. The really interesting thing about Eat Out to Help Out, which was one of the topics covered today, I think we were very much against the policy. I think it was a bad policy. But the one thing you can say for it is it's one of the few times during the pandemic where actually policymakers, politicians were thinking about something other than just trying to limit COVID cases. And the problem is for that 18 months, we basically had one policy priority, and the result of that has been enormous damage to every single other area.
Because obviously Eat Out to Help Out was expensive.
It was expensive,
but
yeah,
what it did
expensive.
do was the hospitality sector was in complete crisis.
Yeah.
It did give people confidence to go out and to socialise and to start spending money again, to protect jobs, and that was very much the Chancellor's key objective. In that sense, I would argue, yes, it was expensive, but it did work. It did achieve that objective of getting things going again.
Yeah, and I can absolutely understand the rationale behind it. The problem is all of that progress was then undone by the fact that we then had more or less 6, 7, 8 months of almost continuous and very severe lockdowns. And I think this brings back to the problem of the COVID inquiry. It's just looking at, did lockdown work in the very limited focus of bringing down cases of this respiratory illness that we know would have gone around anyway, and it's not looking at, in the overall picture, when you think of education, other healthcare, business, mental health, all of those other factors, it's essentially ignoring.
Absolutely right. And I think my concern about this, the approach of the barrister, is that actually he said that the cases went up after Eat Out to Help Out, and that was to blame. But then there's a graph, which I've used before, that shows the growth in cases at the identical time in September in France and in Portugal. They didn't have that Eat Out to Help Out. So I'm afraid actually the barristers, that graph is on the screen now. The grey column there is August 2020, the Eat Out to Help Out period. You can see then that actually France and Portugal's case numbers increased almost identically with the UK. Angus, just finally, your thought on that. The barrister's completely wrong on that, wasn't he?
Yes, well, they've got it wrong on a lot of things, especially with regards to did lockdown have any effect on the impact of the wave? Because we now know it didn't, and yet there's this implication. And I cannot believe the conclusions they're drawing is that if we'd locked down earlier, everything would have been better. It wouldn't have made a blind bit of difference.
Gentlemen, we're going to be